Hello, students, and welcome to Chapter 20. I'm Sage, and I'm going to talk about urinary and reproductive system infections. This chapter talks about several sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, including chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. I'm not going to be talking about those three in particular in this lecture video, but I do encourage you to read about them in your textbook because they are pretty common. Today, I'm going to focus on some basics of the systems and some of the major diseases that we see with them. All right, so let's dive in. First off, we have differences in our urinary systems between males and females, and I want to point that out off the top. We both have, males and females, two kidneys, and they're towards the back of the abdominal cavity. They're connected to the bladder by ureters. Each kidney drains into a ureter, and that leads to the bladder, storage unit for the urine, and then the urethra. The urethra brings the urine to the outside of the body. And the big difference here, if you notice carefully, is that the urethra in the males is much longer than the urethra in the females. The male urethra travels the length of the penis and also goes through the prostate gland in the process. What's the big deal with that? Well, urinary tract infections can have a much larger effect on the female than the male because the bacteria that may start at the opening of the urethra would have a shorter trip to get to the bladder and cause more serious infections in a female than a male. It takes more time for the bacteria to make that trip up to the bladder in a male. Also, the urethral opening in a female is it's closer to the anus than with a male. So that can also lead to contamination of the urinary system. I don't show it here, but the reproductive systems in males and females are obviously different, and we're focusing on the main reproductive areas of the males and females: the penis, the vagina, the testes, and the ovaries and the uterus for the female. I kind of mixed those all up, but I think you know the difference. The urinary system microbiome is one that often gets overlooked. When we think about a microbiome, we're often thinking about the gut microbiome. And while that's certainly a big part of our bodily microbiome and the other organisms that occupy our space, every system of the body has bacteria, viruses, microbes that occupy it, including our lungs, pulmonary system, our circulatory system, even our nervous system. So having a system of the body with an external opening makes sense that it would have a rich microbiome and it would be diverse. That microbiome is going to vary in composition, species composition, depending on where in the system you're looking at. For example, the kidneys way up in our body are going to have fewer microbes than the urethral opening, which is external and at that transition. So we're going to see a lot of differences there. And we'll also see differences of the microbiome within one individual throughout their life. Age, sex, environmental factors such as health, food can all contribute to different species in the microbiome. And while there are over a dozen different genera in this system, Lactobacillus and Streptococcus are the most common genera that we find. Okay? And those are pretty common throughout our bodies. Lactobacillus and Streptococcus should be common names for you by now. And the textbook lists several others that you can notice, but these are two that you should be aware of. These are in a healthy urinary tract. So if you were doing a urine sample, you found these two, you'd want to, of course, pay attention to the concentrations of them, but they wouldn't be uncommon to find in a healthy urine sample. This is jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to touch on some pathogens that cross the placenta. These are called torch agents, and that's an acronym you could look up in the text. But the placenta is an organ that develops in pregnancy. It's not always there. So once a pregnancy starts, placenta develops, and this has many functions for the developing fetus. One is protection, and even though it is an important barrier for the fetus, a number of pathogens can cross it that can cause serious complications. So a lot of people think that the developing fetus is fully protected in the uterus with a placenta, with an amniotic sac, and all of those are true, but there are some bacteria, some viruses that can affect an unborn baby. Okay. Male reproductive system microbiome includes many different phyla. And so phyla, that's a very big category of organisms. So we've got proteobacteria, actinobacteria, fusobacteria, all those different types, and a nice breakdown pie chart over on the right-hand side of that slide. So pretty cool to check out. Okay, we're going to be looking at UTIs specifically, and I want to talk about some of these terms. Whenever we see itis at the end of a word, that's usually an indication that there's inflammation. So urethritis, cystitis, ureteritis, pyelonephritis, those all involve inflammation of the urethra, bladder, ureter, kidneys. Renal failure on here, it's a condition where kidneys can't filter waste effectively or balance fluids, and can't filter the blood. That would be an extreme version of an infection of the urinary system, when the infection gets all the way up to the kidneys. Usually we'll start with urethritis. If we have a urinary tract infection, then it can travel up to the bladder, then up to the ureters, and then up to the kidneys, eventually leading to that failure that would be very detrimental. And hopefully along the way, this infection can get spotted and treated. One of the most common ways to treat the urinary tract infections is with sulfa antibiotics, an antimicrobial that was talked about in an earlier chapter. Penicillin can also be effective. So those terms give us an indication that urinary tract infections, or UTIs, are often described by the part of the urinary tract that are affected. We have some generalities associated with urinary tract infections. They're usually caused by bacteria. They're usually, the further the upstream the infection, that is more interior of the body, the more serious. So infections of the kidneys tend to be more serious than infections of the urethra. Okay, so what causes a UTI? Well, the most common cause of UTIs are uropathogenic E. coli, or UPEC. Some people just say E. coli. We know E. coli already. And so while we had some healthy microbes before, Streptococcus and Lactobacillus, commonly found in our urine, when we have E. coli in our urine, it's typically an indication of a developing or full-blown infection. Okay. So these uropathogenic E. coli are flagellated. They have flagella. They can move about, and they're gram-negative rods. And they can even become filamentous during infection. So they can change their morphology based on where they are in the body and what they're doing. And so just typically these will cause up to 95 or up to 65% of complicated UTIs and up to 95% of uncomplicated UTIs. And so that's a difference defined by the presence of catheters and other conditions in the body. Those aren't the only bacteria. The E. coli aren't the only bacteria that can cause UTIs. Gram-positive bacteria can also cause UTIs. And these can be introduced to the urethra from skin, genitalia. The most common gram-positive bacteria in UTIs are Staphylococcus saprophyticus, okay, a staph species, Enterococcus faecalis. That one indicates fecal material, so something digestive. We're looking at the anus being close to the urethra and contamination happening that way. There's also group B strep and Staphylococcus aureus. Okay, so hopefully students will do presentations on the urinary system in the lab. The UTI topic is one that's really important for a lot of nurses because it's so commonly found in clinical settings with patients ranging in age from the very young to the very old. And some populations of elderly people typically get urinary tract infections. Okay, and it could lead to senility symptoms, people behaving as if they have dementia. So it's an important disease, dysbiosis, to be aware of and be thoroughly prepared for. Okay, so just a little bit about some other STIs. Many sexually transmitted pathogens don't target the reproductive system specifically. So STIs include bacterial, viral, parasitic, and fungal pathogens. And any STI that causes lesions or ulcers or pronounced inflammation can lead to an increased risk for transmission of HIV or bloodborne STIs. So when we have something like herpes that causes a lesion, that can increase the transmission of other sexually transmitted infections also. The World Health Organization estimates that ulcerative STIs, those are the sexually transmitted infections that cause ulcers or lesions, increase that risk of HIV transmission by 10 to 15% in women and up to 300% in men. Okay. So the human papillomavirus, this is one that includes a variety of serovars, and these cause the most common sexually transmitted infections in the world. HPVs are very common. There are over 200 known subtypes, so this is a very big group. And 40 of those subtypes, about 40, are sexually transmitted. They're so common that almost every sexually active person will be infected with some type of human papillomavirus in their lifetime. This is a virus that has a vaccine for it, and it's commonly given in the US to people younger than 12. Get a certain series of this vaccine. People older than 12 get another series or set. And those prescriptions or recommendations are currently in flux. But we do have that vaccine ready for us. And it's an important one because HPV can lead to cancers. So signs and symptoms, most people are asymptomatic. HPV can lead to 90% of cervical cancers, and so that's a big risk for it. These viruses can be self-resolving within 2 years for many patients, but for some it can cause issues that recur throughout the life. The vaccine and pap smear screening are good ways to prevent HPV and to prevent the complications that happen from it. So again, please check out chapter 20 in your text. Hope this is a good start for you, and see you in lab.